Long before the world was consumed by the tidal wave of Beatlemania, and before their names became synonymous with a cultural revolution, Paul McCartney and George Harrison were simply two schoolboys navigating the gray post-war streets of Liverpool. Their story began in 1954, not in a recording studio, but on the top deck of a green Liverpool bus. Paul, a year older, and already possessing a reputation as a bright, witty student at the Liverpool Institute High School for Boys, noticed a younger boy, thin, quiet, and struggling to fit into the rigid confines of an educational system he openly loathed. George Harrison would later describe his time at the Institute as the worst time of his life, a period of stifling rules and class divisions. However, those daily bus journeys became a sanctuary where the uniforms and schoolwork faded into the background. On these rides, George noticed Paul carrying a guitar, and the conversation quickly shifted from the drudgery of academics to the electric allure of music. They were both caught in the grip of the skiffle craze, sweeping Britain, a raw, homemade style that made every teenager believe they could be a star. Together, they shared a fervent admiration for American icons like Elvis Presley, Buddy Holly, and Little Richard. George, in particular, was so mesmerized by the raw sound of Heartbreak Hotel that he spent his nights sketching guitars in his notebooks and practicing chords until his fingers were raw and bleeding. Paul, who had grown up in a musical household led by a father who was once a jazz band leader, quickly recognized George's singular dedication. Though a year's age difference was significant in their youth, the shared language of music erased the barrier. By 1957, Paul had joined John Lennon's band, the Quarrymen, and when the group needed another guitarist, he immediately thought of his younger friend. Lennon was initially skeptical, dismissing George as too young and baby-faced to join his gang. The turning point was a moment of cinematic perfection. One evening on the top deck of a bus, George pulled out his guitar for an audition that would alter the course of history. He played a note-perfect version of Bill Eustace's raunchy, a difficult rockabilly instrumental. Lennon, unable to deny such undeniable skill, invited the 15-year-old into the fold. With George on board, the nucleus of the Beatles was complete. For Paul, who had lost his mother to cancer when he was only 14, this burgeoning friendship offered a profound sense of companionship and purpose. For George, joining the older boys was the validation he craved, proof that his talent allowed him to belong among more experienced players. This early period cemented Paul's role as George's mentor and champion, creating a brotherhood rooted in shared dreams. Yet even in these early harmonies, the seeds of a complex rivalry were being sown. They were learning new chords and writing fragments of songs, daring to imagine a future beyond Liverpool, unaware that the very ambition that brought them together would eventually become the source of their greatest conflicts. By the mid-1960s, the intimacy of the Liverpool bus had been replaced by the deafening perpetual roar of global adoration. Paul McCartney and George Harrison were no longer just boys with guitars. They were the architects of a new cultural world, and with that fame came a crushing, invisible pressure. Yet, as the spotlights grew brighter, the shadows between them began to lengthen. In January 1966, a moment of profound personal harmony occurred when George married Pattie Boyd. Paul was the only other Beatle to attend, serving as George's best man, a role that spoke to a bond still rooted in deep-seated loyalty. During a lull in the wedding festivities, Paul even took it upon himself to entertain Pattie's younger half-brothers David and Boo, taking them outside to a disused bathroom to show them how to use George's bow and arrows. It was a rare glimpse of the simple brotherhood they once shared, a brief pause before the creative gears of the Beatles began to grind against their individual souls. The true shift in their power dynamics solidified during the 1967 recording of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. This landmark project was largely Paul's vision, a masterpiece that redefined rock music but left George feeling increasingly suffocated. While Paul thrived in the studio as the band's driving creative force, orchestrating arrangements and demanding a standard of absolute perfection, George found that the space for his own ideas was rapidly shrinking. George's lone contribution to the album Within You, Without You reflected his growing immersion in Indian philosophy and spiritual music, a deeply personal journey that stood apart from the rest of the album's concept. To Paul, it was simply another track in a concept album. To George, it was a lifeline to a world beyond the vanity of fame. This spiritual divergence reached a breaking point during the Beatles' 1968 journey to India to learn transcendental meditation. George saw this as a life-changing spiritual necessity, whereas Paul often viewed it as a mere diversion from the real work of making music. Paul recalled joking with George about his newfound intensity, saying, "Oh yeah, all right, Georgie boy, calm down. Sense of humor needed here, you know." But for George, this was no laughing matter. He believed the band's obsession with records and business was a distraction from the spiritual path he felt was essential for his survival. The friction between them became so sharp that it began to leak into their business interactions. When McCartney later called Harrison to discuss the band, potentially leaving Apple Records, Harrison's frustration boiled over into a stinging retort, "You'll stay on the fucking label, Hare Krishna." By the end of the decade, the baby-faced younger brother was no longer content to live in the creative shadows of the Lennon-McCartney catalog. The silent cracks had formed, and George was no longer willing to simply follow Paul's lead. The stage was set for the winter of their discontent, where the harmony of their youth would finally shatter under the weight of unshared dreams. By the dawn of 1969, the vibrant colors of the Summer of Love had faded into a cold gray reality for the Beatles. The band was no longer the tight-knit brotherhood of their Liverpool youth. They were four men adrift in a sea of creative and personal exhaustion. In January, they gathered at Twickenham Film Studios to record what would eventually become Let It Be. But the atmosphere was far from harmonious. Cameras were constantly rolling to capture a documentary of the process, but instead, they immortalized the slow-motion collapse of history's greatest band. George Harrison later described this period as a winter of discontent, a time that was profoundly unhealthy and unhappy for his soul. The primary source of his frustration was Paul McCartney's increasingly dominant and controlling presence. Paul, thriving on his own creative momentum, frequently directed the others with an intensity that bordered on arrogance. In George's eyes, Paul had become insensitive to the egos and feelings of his bandmates, seeing them merely as an accompaniment to his own vision. The tension finally boiled over into one of the most famous arguments in rock history. After Paul issued yet another set of precise instructions, George snapped back with a weary, biting sarcasm. "I'll play whatever you want me to play, or I won't play at all if you don't want me to. Whatever it is that will please you, I'll do it." It was a moment that exposed years of being sidelined and silenced. George was no longer the baby-faced younger brother. He was a confident songwriter with a massive catalog of unheard material, including masterpieces like All Things Must Pass and Isn't It a Pity? Yet Paul and John continued to dominate the sessions, leaving little room for George to breathe. On January 10, 1969, George reached his limit. In the middle of a rehearsal, he simply walked out, deciding that he could be relatively happy on his own, but was incapable of being happy in that suffocating environment. While John Lennon had spoken of quitting before George's departure, sent genuine shockwaves through the group. That very day, George channeled his frustration into a new song titled Wah Wah, a track that reflected the headache he felt the band, and specifically Paul, had become. George did return 12 days later, but the foundation of the Beatles had been permanently cracked. Even as they managed to complete their work, the resentment remained sharp. Later that year, Paul admitted to John that until then their songs had been better than George's, but that this year his songs are at least as good as ours. George dismissed this as a myth, insisting he had been writing high-quality music for years. He simply felt Paul was unwilling to share the creative space. The scars of 1969 were etched into the music. On his landmark solo album, All Things Must Pass, George included the track Run of the Mill, which contained lyrics pointed directly at Paul's perceived incompetence and the breakdown of their partnership. The friendship was deeply wounded, bound together only by a history that was becoming a burden. Even as the atmosphere within the band turned toxic and the Beatles began to unravel, 1969 brought a bittersweet victory for George Harrison, a long-overdue moment of global recognition. When the group gathered to record Abbey Road, it was Harrison who delivered two of the most enduring masterpieces in the history of music, Here Comes the Sun and Something. The world was stunned by the depth of his talent. Frank Sinatra would eventually call Something the greatest love song ever written, and even John Lennon admitted it was the finest track on the album. For George, this was more than success. It was vindication after years of his songwriting being treated as secondary to the Lennon-McCartney catalog. For Paul, however, it was a sharp reminder that the balance of power he had meticulously maintained was shifting irrevocably. Despite the brilliance of the music they produced, the sessions were far from warm. George deeply resented Paul's constant interference with song arrangements, while Paul privately believed George lacked the discipline to refine his complex ideas. Their relationship had become professional, yet chilled by a decade of unsaid grievances. By the time Abbey Road was released in September 1969, the Fab Four were already effectively over. The breakup became official in 1970, and each man set out to prove he could survive and thrive without the other. The 1970s became an era of solo triumph and lingering bitterness. George quickly released his landmark triple album, All Things Must Pass, a work of such spiritual depth and maturity that it stunned the critics who had long overlooked him. Meanwhile, Paul launched his own journey with the album McCartney, and eventually formed Wings, relentlessly pursuing the commercial success he craved. Throughout this decade, their interactions remained sporadic and often cold. In public interviews, George was uncharacteristically blunt about his feelings, admitting he found Paul overpowering and famously remarking that while he would happily play in a band with John Lennon again, he would never do so with Paul. Though Paul often shrugged off these comments in public, the sting of those words lingered in private. The rift between them widened further in 1971 when George invited Paul to perform at the legendary Concert for Bangladesh. Paul declined, citing concerns over logistics, an absence that only served to harden George's resolve to keep his distance. For much of the 1970s, it seemed the two men were defined by their unresolved issues, George focusing on his spiritual path and independent projects, while Paul focused on his global pop dominance. Yet, even in the midst of this Cold War, an invisible thread remained, a shared history that neither man could truly escape. They were bound by the songs they had written, the buses they had ridden, and a brotherhood that refused to stay buried, even under the weight of an era of silence. By the early 1990s, the sharp edges of the 1970s had begun to soften, as time and life experience brought Paul McCartney and George Harrison back toward one another. On February 11, 1994, the unthinkable happened. George, Paul, and Ringo Starr reunited at McCartney's studio to breathe life into unfinished demos left behind by John Lennon. The press quickly dubbed them the Threetles, and for a global audience, it felt like the resurrection of a sacred bond long thought lost. Yet, as the tapes began to roll, the ghosts of their old dynamics immediately resurfaced in the room. George arrived at these sessions with a newfound assertiveness, determined to protect his own creative spirit. He insisted that his close friend Jeff Lynne produce the tracks, issuing a stark warning to Paul that without a neutral outside hand, the project could easily dissolve into the same chaos that had fractured them decades earlier. Paul later recalled George's blunt assessment, "No, we need a producer. It could be dangerous just to all get in the studio. Could get nasty. You've got egos flying around." Even in reconciliation, George's words carried the heavy weight of their shared, painful history. The collaboration produced Free as a Bird and Real Love, but the creative friction remained palpable. They clashed over the very soul of the reunion. Paul fought to keep the sound quintessentially Beatles, while George pushed for simplicity and followed his own melodic instincts. They disagreed on guitar solos and vied for the best lyric to complete Lennon's unfinished lines. Despite these disagreements, the music became a bridge back to their past, and Paul began to publicly acknowledge what he had failed to see in the 1960s: George's immense genius as a songwriter. In a moment of profound reflection, Paul admitted he had underestimated his younger bandmate, calling him a late bloomer who had ultimately written some of the greatest songs in history. Yet, as their professional respect deepened, George remained honest about the fragility of their personal bond, admitting he still found Paul overpowering and could not imagine being in a full-time band with him again. This period of fragile peace was soon overshadowed by a series of devastating blows to George's health. In 1997, he was diagnosed with throat cancer, followed later by treatments for lung cancer and a brain tumor. In 1999, the world was shocked when George survived a violent knife attack in his own home at Friar Park, an event that left him physically weakened but spiritually resolute. Throughout these trials, the invisible thread between the two Liverpool lads never snapped. Paul visited George when he could, and as the diagnosis grew increasingly grim, the petty quarrels of the studio fell away to reveal the brotherhood that had always been the foundation of their lives. The man Paul once directed with an iron hand was now the little baby brother he was terrified to lose. As the decade closed, the connection between them deepened in the quiet of hospital rooms, moving toward a final harmony that would transcend music itself. On November 29, 2001, the long, winding road that began on the top deck of a green Liverpool bus finally reached its end in this physical realm. George Harrison, the quiet Beatle who had spent his life seeking a light beyond the stage, passed away at the age of 58 after a grueling battle with throat and lung cancer that had eventually reached his brain. He was a man who had survived fame, creative stifling, and even a violent knife attack in his own home to remain spiritually resolute until the very last breath. In accordance with the Hindu beliefs that had become his compass, his ashes were scattered in the sacred waters of the Ganges and Yamuna rivers, a final surrender to the spiritual path he had championed for so long. For Paul McCartney, the loss was a devastating blow that stripped away the armor of their past rivalries. In the final chapter of George's life, the bitter arguments of the Let It Be sessions and the cold silences of the 1970s dissolved into a profound, heart-wrenching tenderness. Just 10 days before George's death, Paul sat by his side in a New York hospital for hours. In that quiet room, they were no longer icons or competitors. They were simply brothers again, joking about nutty stuff, as if they were dreaming of their youth. In a moment that shattered the unspoken code of their tough Liverpool upbringing, where lads never showed such affection, they reached out and held hands. "He was my little baby brother," Paul would later say, his voice cracking with the weight of half a century of shared history. The day after George left this world, shattered, Paul stood before reporters and struggled to find words for a man who had been part of his soul since boyhood. He called George a lovely man and a very brave man, insisting that he would be remembered as a giant in his own right, far beyond the shadow of the band that had once threatened to consume him. But for Paul, the memory of George is not something confined to archival footage or gold records. It is something living and breathing in the earth itself. George, the passionate gardener who saw divinity in nature, had given Paul a gift, a large fir tree planted near the gate of Paul's home. Every morning, as Paul leaves his house, he stops to look up at those strong green branches growing toward the sky and whispers, "Hi, George." For Paul, George has entered that tree, standing as a rooted eternal guardian of their friendship. The thread of their brotherhood has even extended to a new generation, proving that the bond they forged was deeper than any musical rivalry. George's son Donnie and Paul's daughter Stella share a relationship that mirrors the deep sibling-like connection of their fathers. When Donnie married in 2012, Stella designed the bride's dress. When Stella is honored for her work, Donnie is there to surprise her with music. Donnie once remarked that Stella has looked out for me my whole life, a living legacy of the protection and love that ultimately won out over the egos and the fame. The story of Paul and George is a masterpiece of the human experience, a journey from the innocence of a school bus to the pinnacle of the world through the fire of conflict, and finally into the quiet peace of a hospital room. It is a reminder that even the most fractured relationships can find their way back to harmony if given the grace of time. As the years go by, the world still listens to the music they made, but Paul simply looks at his tree and knows that his little brother is still there, growing strongly in the light.